Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. You're watching Let's Talk, and we are talking about the criminal justice system. With me are three distinguished lawyers who have kindly given up their valuable time to join us today and share it with you. If you would like to participate in this program, there is a number at the bottom of your screens. Feel free to call in. We would love to hear from you. Now, I'd like to start off with a question to George, please. The Bangladeshi community, the British Bangladeshi community, especially in places like Tower Hamlets and other major cities, have often been associated with deprivation, a working class environment and so forth. And they are not immune to criminal activities around them, which I dare say influences them as well. What would you say to our community about how they can move away from criminality and being tempted by that and falling into that sort of vicious cycle, so to speak?
Well, I think I would start by saying that it is a vicious cycle. I think not just the Bangladeshi community, but other communities as well. I think that cycle can be broken with quite a bit of input from, for example, parents, encouraging their children to engage more in community activities. I think there should be a greater emphasis which should be portrayed from the schools, for example. Schools, particularly in the Bangladeshi community, for example, should focus more on teaching other children from other communities about different communities and helping children to engage from a very young age into the different cultures. I think it's very important. Now, as a criminal defence lawyer, I've represented a number of youths, not just from the Bangladeshi community, but from various communities in London. And it is sad when I see parents that just give up on their children because they've committed a crime. Now, obviously, they've done something because they've been wrongly influenced by other individuals. This often happens at schools. I'll give you a classic example, knife crime. Knife crime is a very big problem in London. It needs to be tackled head on. There are various punishments available for carrying knives, but I believe that youth should be educated within the community and given as much support as possible to understand the dangers of getting on the wrong side of the law. And it just goes back to another point I mentioned about austerity cuts. Legal aid cuts, unfortunately, are going to cause awful problems to communities such as this. And one only hopes that there are methods to save a system which unfortunately will be failing in due course.
George, thank you very much indeed. Just before I come to David, we've got a caller waiting. Perhaps if we can take that call and see what they have to say. Hello, caller. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Welcome to the show. You're live on air. What would you like to say?
Fantastic. Am I live, yeah?
You are indeed. Go ahead.
Brilliant. Just wanted to make a quick statement. Basically, if you label someone a troublemaker, and if you treat them as a troublemaker, eventually they will grow up to be a troublemaker. It's highly likely. The problem we have is with the matter of stop and searches. I believe, along with there are a number of other people in London, I'm sure out of London as well, who feel as though the stop and search powers given to the police are being abused. It is being, and I think if you do look at the statistics, there are a high number of people that are being stopped and searched where it does not result to any arrest. And I think the police forget that they are stopping and searching human beings and the effect it does have on that human being. As far as the police are concerned, I think on a majority of cases it's just nothing more than a numbers game for them. The police are there to protect the public. The way they are conducting themselves at the moment, it is leaving especially youngsters, feeling as though it is them against the police rather than working together. I think there needs to be a change in the way stop and searches are carried out. Of course, one argument is that the police only stop and search where they have reasonable grounds, but that is very ambiguous. Reasonable is they can justify their search pretty much however they like. They can pretty much make up whatever reason they like, and that's what is going on at the moment.
Caller, thank you very much for your call. Very interesting points that you raised. I think Theresa May very recently has addressed this particular issue and spoken to the relevant authority about it. David, I'd like to bring you into the debate when we were talking about the issues with George.
Yeah, I mean, Theresa May, in my view, hasn't gone far enough that you cause right. She should legislate, and what she's talking about is the police sorting out themselves, and she's given that threat. But I think that she should have gone further.
So you think the speech that she gave to the Federation recently, you think quite soon she should actually go ahead and
the choice she's given to the police is to look from change from within.
Right.
But the issue about stop and search has blighted our inner city communities for generations, and it's continuing to happen.
Right.
And I think the police have had long enough to sort it out. Right. Policing in this community and any community is by consent. Yes. It's a privilege and not a right. And there should have been legislation in this area around about stop and search. But just going, from lighter subjects about social mobility, and I would say this to any of your younger viewers watching, is that you have talent. You may have talent to be a lawyer. You may have talent with your hands. I know that I was absolutely just appalling in my woodwork and DIY classes. But whatever your talent is, find your talent and work hard at it, and you'll succeed. I do remember I was a teacher at my school talking about, and what he stood at the front and said, look, if you aim here in life, you'll get here. But if you aim down here, you'll get down here. And just what I'd say to your younger viewers, try and speak to any teenagers who are doing their exams now, it's the hot summer months coming ahead, is to keep working hard. It's what I call delayed gratification. Often you can see other friends out playing in the streets or whatever, and you're inside studying away. Try and study, because your time will come. You might see friends now starting work early, and that's a good thing that they're starting work. But if you want a profession, you do have to study for many years, and so just wait and work hard, and you'll get that. And I know, just in the panel today, from the discussions we've had off air while the breaks are on, we all come from working class backgrounds. I come from the Irish community, George comes from the Greek Cypriot community, and we all come from very ordinary backgrounds, but it's just through hard work and endeavour, and there's no substitute for that.
Absolutely, very good. Mahtab Bhai, what would you say to our viewers in terms of what they need to do to make sure that their youth do not fall into the vicious cycle that George was talking about? But try and enrich themselves, of the kind of approach that David was talking about in terms of working hard, either through education or if you don't have the opportunity there, perhaps through becoming an artisan, using your hands and actually going into a trade.
Well, yes, I mean, I could spend hours sort of talking about this particular topic, but short amount of time. Yes, everything George has said, David said, was very correct. I agree with. But what I found with working with so many youths is there seems to be a lack of motivation, and that motivation is lacking because of perhaps a failure in the education system.
Well, one of our callers, the last caller, he was actually talking about the suspicions of the police, and that perhaps being a reason why certain groups of people in certain inner cities are not encouraged to actually go out and do more. They feel that they are targeted unfairly, but they feel that they're being labelled a particular type of person, and that's how eventually they evolve to become that type of person. How true is our caller?
Yeah, well, and that's to do with perhaps what we call self-esteem. If a person doesn't value themselves, they will come into this unfortunate circumstance where they will not be in a position to be able to do much about it. You see, and from my experience, I know certainly that youths do want to do well, but the circumstances prevent them from doing well. unfortunately.
I would just add that the last caller has a very valid point. If a youth gets stopped in the street and he's searched by a police officer, that youth will remember that search, and there is evidence to suggest that people obviously have that label, and the caller is absolutely right, that is a problem. I'm pleased it's being addressed. It needs to be addressed. I think the police need to show a great deal of restraint, especially when it comes to searching youths on the street. I think it's very important.
Well, George, you worked very hard. You've now become a very well-respected leading lawyer. What advice would you give to our parents out there who've got perhaps small children and they're trying to get on in these difficult times, and especially if they're located within inner cities, for example, where it's even more difficult because the peer groups, the pressures that come from those sorts of fields, the kind of absences of support from the kind of environments which I think Rabia was talking about from Birmingham. What sort of advice would you give to our viewers, the parents out there?
Well, my advice is, and obviously there are some very good parents, not just in this community, but in my community. I think it's very important not to give up on the failings of various parts of the system. I think it's very important to support children from a very early age, to make it very clear that they are loved and supported, and not to fall in the trap of the failings of the system, regardless of whether it's legal aid, regardless of whether it's the police, regardless of whether it's education. I think a home is very important, and I'm sure there are many, if not thousands, of members of this community who provide the necessary assistance to children. But as I've stated earlier, I've worked very closely with youths in the past, and I think one of the biggest problems is the failings in the system and parents simply just giving up and having to rely on the system generally. But I think the parents are key. They really need to work very closely with parents, and I'm sure in this community there are many parents that do that, but it's important that that is maintained. Absolutely. So good parenting. I mean, you see people come through your doors and you represent youths, for example, or you know, adults. Yes. You know, and when you see them, I suspect you see the kind of potential that they could have had, whereas they found themselves in this particular situation where they've burnt their boats, because once they've got a criminal record of a particular nature, they can't exactly go enter into every single profession. There are a lot of, it sort of narrows themselves down, doesn't it? Yeah, I've seen that a lot. And it goes without say, the youth justice system in the United Kingdom, it does give youths a chance. I think one of the things we did discuss during the break was the worst case scenario is a youth being incarcerated for committing an offence, any offence. I'm not saying that's not justifiable in certain cases, it can be. However, if a youth has committed an offence for the very first time, that youth should be worked with, and there are various ways of doing that. One of the ways of doing that is the Youth Offending Service. They do a great job, but unfortunately austerity is going to affect them as well. It's going to affect the probation service generally, and that is a problem. And my view is, without getting too political about it, but my view is parents have to work a lot harder to ensure that their children are not, they don't actually fall into that trap, the failings of the system. Parents need to work a lot harder to counter-attack that potential problem in the future. George, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to come on to George to David in a moment, and I'm going to be asking him what he thinks that the government can do. I would like to hear from you what you believe the government can do to deal with these sorts of problems within our communities. And I think we do have a caller online at the moment. Perhaps I can take that caller. Hello, Assalamu alaikum, caller.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum. How are you, Babul Bhai?
Welcome, salam. Thank you for the call. Who's this?
Yes, I don't want to give my name out.
Oh, very well. Very well.
By the way, thank you for Channel S and the panel who's sitting down there. We have a very good program today about youth crime and legal aid cut. I actually think it's very confusing that they're doing legal aid cuts, but the problem is there's so many stuff happening out there. And Babul Bhai, I'd just like to say to the solicitor, thank you for coming in. But
we've got two solicitors. We've got Mahtab Bhai to my left, and we've got George to my right. But thank you to both of them, of course, for coming
definitely.
in. Absolutely.
Thank you to Mahtab and George. George, is George there?
Yes, he is. He's listening.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask George a question, but you said earlier on, like, about the police station. You don't go to the police station, do you?
I do actually.
You do go to
I do attend police stations on various occasions.
Okay. No, because there's a lot of confusion sometimes. People do get in a lot of trouble, and there are people out there who, when there's a case happens, and obviously there's like 3 against 1, and they would say, oh, this person has done something, and probably he never. So this is the problem we have. That's why we have solicitors. So I don't know why they're doing the legal aid cuts, and especially earlier on, the sister who said she works for the Bangladeshi community. It's just not Bangladeshi. You have Pakistani, you have Indian, and sometimes there are people who have language barriers. So that's why that's another problem. But anyway, thanks George and Matabai for coming in, and thank you for Channel S, and Babul Bhai, you're doing a very good job there.
Thank you very much indeed. But David, thank you for
Assalamu alaikum.
welcome salam. Thank you to David as well, who's a very, very busy man indeed, I assure you. Now, George, if you don't mind, I'm going to move very swiftly to David and ask him. I was inviting our viewers to call in. This is their last chance to call in and tell us what they believe the government can do.
Yes.
But I'd like to hear from you. Well, we would like to hear from you as well as to what you believe the role the government can play in order to deal with the kind of difficulties which the communities are facing.
Well, it's all about unleashing aspiration. And I sort of banged my drum tonight about investment in the youth and education. But I think the role of Education Secretary in this country, Mr. Gove's currently got that particular post, is one of the most important cabinet roles, and it needs to have that elevated and important status. For me, it ranks right alongside Home Secretary. For me, it ranks right alongside the Chancellor, because this is through education. You can change people's lives. Through learning to read, you can change people's lives and be numerous. And it's about unleashing that aspiration. You can only do that through education. So that's where our investment needs to be.
It's very important you say that, because if we take Tower Hamlets as a case in point, in Tower Hamlets we now see that in every home you have a graduate, where the parents themselves may well be illiterate or of very limited educational ability or experience. In fact, in many homes within Tower Hamlets you have several graduates. This is very encouraging, and you see that through education, as you correctly say, people have been able to be either socially mobile or certainly move away from any sort of cycle of criminality or other unsociable experiences and what have you.
My brother and I,
sorry, go on.
My brother and I were the first graduates in our family as well. I'm first generation British. I was born in the Northwest. I was a single parent family. But my mother and father both hail from Ireland. So a very similar experience within the Irish communities. But it's through education I realised once I got to university, it raises your sights. And you think in a very ordinary way, do you know what, I could do that. I think I could become a lawyer, or I could be a doctor, or I could become a teacher. And that's what the whole idea is about, sort of education and encouraging children to come forward. Of course, we've got a skills shortage in this country at the moment, so it's not just about the professions, teaching, doctors, nurses, whatever, but those sort of artisan professions you're talking about, working with your hands, and they shouldn't be overlooked or looked down upon. Stonemasons, and my grandfather was a carpenter. These are very important professions. And you can make a very good living.
Or even chefs, because in our community, the catering industry is very important.
Yes.
And some of the leading chefs go on to own and run their own very successful restaurants.
Yeah.
Of international standards.
Yes.
And so yes, when you talk about those sort of practical professions, they can also be ways of actually moving on in life and getting on in a serious profession.
But just touching back to the law, I just want to say a final point on that. And if you do find yourself in the unfortunate position of being stopped and then arrested, then when you go to the police station, exercise your rights to have a lawyer there. You said, George said tonight, he's a duty solicitor. You'll get a George Campanella or someone like him in the police station represent you, and it's absolutely essential. It really is.
Yes, or Matab Aziz.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
I think
Yeah,
the point
sorry.
that David is trying to put forward, it's imperative, especially youth, it's imperative that people are represented at the police station, because if they're not, if they don't receive adequate representation at a police station, that could affect the rest of their life, because that's where it all starts. And if that goes wrong from a very early stage, that's irreversible damage. So I take David's point on board very strongly. It's very important. I cannot stress it enough how many mistakes have been made whilst an individual has been at a police station. We're not just talking about communities, but we're talking about people who are vulnerable. It's the vulnerable that need to be looked after, and this is where the main problem lies in the legal aid cuts.
And in terms of education that David was talking about, do you agree that education is a central plank, a central pillar, as it were, in order to be able to actually get on in life, and automatically you'll see that like the fall of dominoes, all sorts of social ills around you will fall away.
Education is very important. You have education, but it doesn't mean to say that people don't make mistakes.
Sure.
Even professionals make mistakes and need representation. But I think that's a very valid point, that education is the pillar, really. It's the pillar, and it often leads to the success of an individual.
George, we've got a caller waiting. Perhaps if we can take the call and see what the caller has to say. Hello, Assalamu alaikum, caller.
Walaikum assalam.
You're live on air. What would you like to say?
Brilliant. I did actually call just a little while ago.
Okay.
I just wanted to say, I understand you moved on to. What the government can do,
Yes.
and I just wanted to make a point where the way the criminal law is structured, criminal justice is structured, is that it has such a heavy influence on a political influence. By that, what I mean is obviously a certain party are in power for a certain number of years, and to lock someone up and throw away the key is a lot more powerful in terms of winning votes, rather than actually hitting the problem and resolving the problem in the long term. And by that, what I mean is maybe, sorry, I don't know the gentleman's name beside you, the solicitor said, actually sitting down with the family or sitting down with the individual and basically discussing with them why they feel the need to do the things that they're doing and rectify the problem. Obviously, to win votes, I think that is not as powerful.
But isn't that the point of democracy? If the government puts forward a measure which is popular, then that will attract votes. And if they don't put forward measures which are popular, then they will see the fruits of that in due course. Thank you for the call in any event. I'd like to bring Matabai in terms of what the government can do. This caller was suggesting that there are other ulterior motives and what have you. Perhaps, what do you say that the government can do? We've heard about the need for education. Well, the education system is already there. It's up to the people themselves, the parents and so forth, or the guardians, to actually make sure that their children take full advantage of education. Is there anything else?
Well, I mean, I think a big problem is drugs. I mean, particularly in Tower Hamlets. Right. A lot of the young youth, unfortunately, go down the path of drugs abuse. And in my day, when I was in my early teens, we used to stay away from the drug dealers because we knew they were bad, and if you associate with them, we'd get into trouble. These days, unfortunately, the drug dealers are the heroes. They're the present-day heroes. They're the people that they look up to. My goodness.
We're coming to the end of our show, Matabai. Just the very final 30 seconds from you, if you will, please.
Yes.
What would you like to tell our viewers about what we've discussed today?
Well, I mean, I think it's extremely important that people take the criminal justice system very seriously, and they must have a good lawyer to represent them, and thus try and avoid any sort of miscarriages of justice. I know that the government is trying to have a more efficient system, but unfortunately it seems to be not working, and there will be more miscarriages of justice. You have to be very careful and treat it very seriously.
Matabai, thank you very much. David, final thoughts, if you will, please.
The one thing our politicians listen to is the ballot box. And if they fear they're going to lose their power and their seat, they'll listen. And I just urge your viewers to write to their MPs to support lawyers and be against legal aid cuts, because the MPs will listen if they get enough letters coming in, because the cuts are going to devastate our communities in the way that we've been discussing this evening. So communities do have the power, and they just need to realise this and take that power up. The power's not with our MPs.
David, thank you very much indeed. George, very, very briefly, if you will, please.
Well, it's just touching on what David said about people understanding the devastation that legal aid cuts can cause. You've got to obviously contact your MP. It's very important, especially at this time of the year, because there's an election next year. And I think people need to understand that it is very important that the rule of law is preserved. I'm not just talking about victims of crime, but I'm also talking about people who have committed the crimes. People need to understand that the key is with the politicians at the end of the day. I think people understand exactly what I'm saying in relation to that. The rule of law must not be affected.
George, thank you very much. I must wrap it up. George, David and Mahtab, thank you very much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. We hope you found this programme informative. I suspect education is a very important factor. The society is what it is. The government is doing what it will do. Of course, you can perhaps affect that at the ballot box and influence that in that way. But in the interim, it is a matter for you to make sure that your children and those around you take full advantage of the wonderful education system that we have in the United Kingdom, relatively speaking, of course. We hope you stay well. Thank you for watching. You do take care. Assalamu alaikum.